How is it going? My name is Teppo Hudson and this is Sprinthack, where we dig into all things product development and product management. This time I will talk with Otto Hilska, CEO and founder of Swarmia. We dive into what is good for developers' life in product teams, how do you work daily in development, and how does the business and development talk to each other on each feature and manage that process. I'm excited, so let's get into it. Let's start a little bit like you telling a little bit who are you and kind of about Swarmia and what you guys do there.
Sure thing. So I started writing code when I was 12, started my first software company as soon as I turned 18. So been working in this space for a while. Since then, I started a company called Flowdoc, which is a team collaboration product similar to Slack. After that was acquired by Rally Software, I spent a few years there and then moved on to Smartly.io to run the product development as we scaled the team from 30 to 350 people. So after that experience and kind of building these great empowered product teams and kind of seeing what kind of tools the teams really need to kind of continuously get better, I started a company called Swarmia to help software development organizations to get better. So if you think about companies like Facebook and Uber, they invest roughly 1/3 of their development resources in infrastructure and developer productivity and kind of just making the rest of your developers more successful. And we're kind of trying to bring that to the rest of the companies out there by helping them identify where the bottlenecks are emerging as you're scaling your teams. And so that each team can kind of continuously just resolve their most pressing issues. Because the reality is that when you're growing fast, half of your team just started. So you want to give them any support you can in kind of analyzing the bottlenecks with feature delivery or code quality or anything else.
Oh, that's actually an interesting aspect, like you mentioning that. As far as I understood, like in any given moment, about half of your team has only started working on the code base. What could you a little bit talk about that? What you mean?
Yeah, I mean, at Smartly, we definitely saw many times that we were even joking when onboarding new developers that the most senior member of the team has been around for 4 months, and they are now kind of teaching the new joiners to work on the code base. And building software products is largely a learning bound problem, meaning that people need to understand all the details about the space and the domain to be able to actually build products that take into account like all of those details. So it always takes some time, and having a team work together on these features is pretty much the only way to do it. You cannot do a one-time knowledge transfer or anything like that. So it's critical to have the well-functioning team that constantly learns and teaches others.
What if you think about then, let's say from a developer point of view, a new developer, a recruitment is hired, and you kind of get them onboarded on your team. What do you recommend would be great things to do on this kind of onboarding phase?
When you start onboarding new developers, it's very tempting to get them to sit in a classroom for a long time. So I try to always find a balance between kind of what can we teach up front and then how do we just get started. Because also one of the biggest problems many developers face when joining a new organization is kind of this analysis paralysis, where it's just really difficult to work on something that you don't know. So I try to get people to always work on the code base in the first week and get their first changes to production, because then when you have that kind of end-to-end feedback loop, then it's a lot easier to kind of then learn continuously and kind of get the courage to work on this stuff. At the same time, there's certainly some context you always need to be able to learn on the job. So every company should definitely invest in some sort of an onboarding where you kind of just gather intelligence on your customers and how people are using the product, and what can we know about the business, and what can we share about the code base, or kind of the overall idea of the architecture. So you want to invest a little bit in both. Trying to my kind of rule of thumb is that you try to spend about 2 hours a day kind of learning in the first weeks, and then the rest of the time on the job learning from a more practical point of view.
Do you think it's important anyway to have, let's say, like a senior or like a lead developer there to guide them through all that, the hustle of the first days?
Yeah, especially now in the remote setting, there's a very different threshold people have for asking questions. And that is one of the big problems in the industry right now, that the barrier of entry for junior developers, for example, is pretty high because of this exact same problem. So companies are not feeling good about being able to onboard more people, and having someone assigned to help you is one of the easy ways to kind of just make it a little bit easier to keep asking questions. And we've always assigned someone to work with new hires. And if you think about like previously in the office setting, we would always make sure that you're sitting next to that person, etc., and doing everything we can to make it as easy as possible to ask those questions all the time.
Do you utilize this kind of like, what's it called, like extreme coding, or like what you work together on the same code base at the same time?
Yeah, pair programming is definitely one of the ways to get started.
Yeah.
It's a great tool at the onboarding phase and when solving more complex issues. I rarely see teams using pair programming all the time, and I don't think it happens. It's also a little bit maybe intimidating to be just kind of pairing all the time, and I find that most developers don't necessarily like that. But having that option out there and practicing it a little bit definitely makes it easier, because just like with almost anything else, if you've never tried it and if you never practiced it, then it's not really in your toolbox. Then you're much more unlikely to actually do it whenever the situation arises where it would actually make a lot of sense to address this complex problem now with some pair programming.
So like as a lead dev, you should have done it a couple of times before you actually take it on on your toolbox, in a sense. Yeah. Actually, that kind of leads to me thinking on Swarmia's point of view, like you said it about the productivity of this development team. Is there a certain data points you exactly kind of let's say fish out to showcase this kind of productivity on, let's say, on the onboarding phases, how fast people get up to speed, so to say, or in long term, how do they kind of perform?
The developer productivity measurement has evolved quite a bit over the last 10 years. So if we think back, we used to have these agile metrics for like looking at something called sprint velocity, which is not really about velocity, but more about how well you are kind of meeting your plans, basically. Then people tried digging some metrics up from Git repositories and doing some Git analytics stuff. That turned out to be mostly toxic metrics that are kind of used for tracking individuals, and it's not as easy to kind of make any decisions how to improve based on those numbers. Then there's a book called Accelerate, which is about DevOps metrics, and they introduced the 4 DORA metrics, which are kind of, for a long time, they were kind of the best researched alternative for it. So measuring things like how long does it take for us to get stuff to production, how often are we deploying, how often does it fail, and how long does it take for us to recover from those failures. So those were a thing that's been around for a while, and the idea there is to kind of balance how quickly can we do things versus how much are we breaking stuff. And now the latest research on this is in a paper called The Space Framework by the same authors as the Accelerate, or some of the same authors. And that's really just saying that there is no way to get one number to describe developer productivity. You have to look at a couple of different categories and then just try to find a balance between these categories. And that very much matches the reality and my experience as well, because while people are looking for this holy grail of getting that one number, they are at the same time kind of alienating the developers and kind of potentially driving bad behavior with something that doesn't make a lot of sense. But if you take a very healthy approach to this and let's just try to be transparent about how we're doing in different areas so that we can have a better conversation about it, then that's actually a really good starting point for getting better.
It's kind of like, that makes me think it's kind of like, because every team is a unique, every person or every developer is a unique, or they maybe have a different ways of working together. So it's really complicated to make them like a number, so to say.
Yeah, exactly. And different teams should focus on different things. So if you have a team that's working on a code base that's been around for 10 plus years and that's generating 90% of your revenue, they have different problems than the team that's working on a greenfield project that's not in use by anyone and that's not even running in production yet. So the latter should be focusing on kind of speed of discovery and building new things and validating that with customers, while the other first team might actually need to focus on some reliability aspects and so on.
Yeah, makes sense. How do you, moving on a little bit like on your daily work, let's say at Swarmia or on your previous projects and companies, how do you usually organize the daily kind of product development? Not necessarily the exact coding itself, because that's every probably teams and their own way of working, but as like a whole, as a product, how do you organize the whole development?
So Swarmia is a small company. We're just 25 people with 11 of them in product development, and it's all one product development team.
Yeah.
So that's, of course, the context for our setting, but we've done similar things in the previous companies too. There's certain company routines that we have every week. So we have a Monday kickoff and a Friday demos every single week. On Mondays, we focus on the business updates and how are we doing. We look at kind of this data studio deck that we built that has all the real-time business data. And we look at things like won deals and lost deals and the competitive ones, and how is the upper funnel coming up, and how is feature adoption developing for the stuff that we recently built, etc. So that's how we start our weeks. And then on Fridays, we demo what did we accomplish that week, what's new in the product, etc. So that's the whole company, and that's bringing the business and the development teams together to talk about these topics. Then the development team itself is pretty standard Kanban style of process. We run daily stand-ups, we run retrospectives every 2 weeks, etc. And finally, the work that we do is split to, first, we have at the highest level, we have company objectives. So that is, what kind of outcomes are we trying to achieve? It's continuously running one objective we have at a time. So like what is the next stage for us as a company, and what does it look like? And we then convert that to longer running projects that are more like kind of, we're looking for a certain outcome with it. So we're looking for people to actually start using these features, etc. So we call them epics, and they usually take some months. And then we just split those epics to stories, which are 1 week, 2 weeks long, and then tasks which are less than a day long. So we kind of try to have this connection between whatever you're doing and what's the objective that it's tied to. And that way we're trying to balance that also with being able to ship in small increments all the time. So we kind of like to split the work to small enough pieces so that, for example, the collaboration with the development team gets a little bit easier. Because another way to do this kind of empowerment of the teams is to really give people like pretty independent projects of their own, which can be good for kind of that empowerment aspect, but usually it's bad for the collaboration aspect in the team if you're kind of just giving it too big of a chunk for someone to work on. So we're trying to find a balance so that when people kind of then open up their plans for this story beforehand and split it to smaller pieces, it's a lot easier for someone else to come in and help you building that. And when you're doing that, like we discussed earlier, being able to share knowledge with your team members while building stuff is one of the most important things you can do, because then everyone knows more about this code base and about this domain.
Definitely. That, like, sure, this kind of epic story task is a pretty probably common way in many teams. What I've seen, and would love to like hear your take on it in a way, is that there sometimes is a kind of a miscommunication between the business way of describing what they want versus how the tech team wants to know, or do they know everything, all the details of it? Because sometimes the story can be very complex, for example. So is there a certain, like, let's say like a process between the business and the development to kind of define these common understanding on, let's say, a story or on epic level?
Yeah, so making the collaboration between business and development teams work is mandatory. You cannot really do without it.
Yeah.
Also, when you're a product company, the product team needs to own the product and how it gets built and what gets built. So that's another thing. There's plenty of companies out there where the business kind of says that we want this, and then that's treated as a fact, even though it might not be based on any actual customer demand, and it might not be validated in any other ways. So we definitely want to have the product team owning that. So we have built all these processes for, first of all, sharing the context and kind of building the customer empathy. So things like developers helping with customer support. We record our customer calls with Gong, and we have every 2 weeks we have a Gong club where people come to watch one of our customer calls, usually from different stages of the process. And then we kind of just talk about what can be learned from this. Did it look like the customer was missing something? Did they misunderstand something? Could we have done something better? And so on. So we try to build that context, and then we gather feedback from different reps around the world, kind of putting it together, trying to get an idea of what are the biggest blockers for different deals. And then what we do on the product side is we pull that together to a roadmap where, again, we try to formalize what is the feature that's the result from this kind of a feedback. And we kind of link that to specific deals or specific discussions that we're having with customers. And then it's kind of they're open for input from anyone else on the business side. We have a product designer who builds mockups around this, so it's a lot easier to talk about these things usually when it's slightly less abstract. And with that, we're able to have the conversation and do a lot of small adjustments already before starting to work on it. And usually we also try to find a couple of customers who are going to be the first kind of alpha users of this feature. So we have feature gates that we can use to release things to only a selected subset of customers. And with that, we're able to then pretty much, usually when we start building something, we start rolling it out to first customers after the first week or so. So there's always something new to show and something to get input from.
Is there a certain kind of well, other ways to phrase this? You said product team owns this product, so to say. So the product team, assuming in your context, means more than just the development team. It's more. It has maybe product owners or some like business-minded people as well?
Yes, the product development team has one product manager and one product designer.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the product function there, in addition to engineering. And we do subscribe to the kind of Marty Kagan school of thought in terms of what is a product manager and so on. That's pretty much how we've been doing it for a long time before his books came out. But I think he did a good job condensing that information.
Do you use that kind of, I think it was Kagan even, but this kind of like feasibility, viability tests, or like you break down, let's say, the development phase in testing different aspects of the feature in that, let's say, in the story, or you break them into separate even stories or something like that?
Well, it's not as strict.
Yeah.
How do you actually do that? But managing risk is, of course, an important role of the product team. And sometimes it's just pretty clear that there is no viability risk here. It's really easy. Sometimes it might be that the viability risk is related to something that we can easily identify. Let's say we're now building a new kind of dashboard view that pulls data from all the different parts of the organization, and we identified early on that the performance of this view is going to be critical, and it's likely going to be a little bit challenging for us. So we kind of decided that let's just quickly test a couple of these queries across this kind of data set. We're looking at things like, well, how big are the customer organizations? How many, let's say, Jira projects they are working on, etc. So it's really specific to your domain and to whatever you're building. But yes, you want to always reduce the risk by doing a little bit of this research upfront, so that then you're able to make better and more informed plans how to actually address this.
Yeah. And do you usually, let's say, when you develop a new feature, do you try to push it to it? Let's just mention like alpha customers or like first users. Do you try to push the feature to them, even, let's say, when it's half done? Maybe some fallback cases are not included yet, error cases.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you want feedback as early as possible. And for example, in our case, given that it's a kind of data heavy product that's visualizing that customer's own data, it means that oftentimes we can't know how it's actually going to look like. We might have an idea that here's going to be a graph of something, but we don't know what kind of decision will you be able to make based on this data that we're going to be showing you. So sometimes we even address that risk by doing a manual visualization just with spreadsheets or something and pulling the data and showing it to the customer and kind of asking, like, does this actually make sense? So yes, we're trying to get it out there as quickly as possible, because with almost any feature development, there is a bunch of unknowns in the beginning, but then there is still a lot of known stuff that you kind of just have to do, all kinds of configurability and anything else you can just add afterwards. So for example, when we build new features, we usually just don't necessarily add any like frame selections or team configuration or anything like that. We just try to hard code stuff enough so that you can have something to show for a customer. And then you start identifying these other bottlenecks. At that point, you're going to see what kind of an issue is the performance of this page, and does this actually make sense, and all of these other things that we talked about. So after that, you're just much more informed in how to continue the development.
Maybe one last aspect on this kind of product and development phase is maybe the kind of a more overarching, like, architectural decisions or so on. Let's say, as a one developer, should they mind the kind of architectural aspects in a way, like how different systems or services work together if it's a bigger project? Or how do you kind of maybe break that or control that the complexity doesn't get out of hands in time?
Keeping the architecture in check in the long term is one of the extremely difficult things in
Mm.
building software. I don't believe in any ways to limit that by role, so that kind of there would be separate architects who would make these decisions or anything like that. So every developer needs to take care of the architecture and take ownership in making sure that you're working on the right code base and kind of so that it makes sense as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
There's plenty of systemic effects that are against you in this. So, for example, people will like when you have multiple teams working on a bigger piece of on a bigger system, developers are much more likely to write code in code bases that they own versus even if it would make sense to have it somewhere else and someone else would own the code base, developers are not going to do it. So there's all of these things that are kind of against you by default, and you have to be really mindful in how do you address that. One of the ways many companies do that is just by writing more as developers and kind of writing these proposals for, I'm about to start a new microservice. This is going to be its scope. The data is going to be handled here. And this is how it's going to interact with the rest of the services. And this is how we are going to make sure that it's reliable and so on. So people write this short document to describe what they're about to do so that other developers will be able to kind of challenge that and ask questions and maybe point out things that you couldn't know about. So these kind of requests for comments or RFCs or they are process used in most of the big tech companies and any of the like Silicon Valley scale ups, and that's a pretty good way to do it. And then you can also kind of circulate these documents in your organization, and just by following them you get a pretty good sense of how things are evolving, etc. So it's actually a pretty nice and effective communication tool, even if you're not yourself part of that project.
So it's so in a way, it's not about. It is exactly like kind of a planning in advance, communicating your plans in advance, and then getting like a vote of confidence from the rest of the team on your plans.
Yeah,
but not that there's one great mind that actually does the planning for you in a way.
Exactly. And actually having a process for this is a great empowerment tool again, because it means that anyone knows that I have an opportunity to drive these bigger projects across the organization if I just start writing a document about it and get input. And also that you're assumed to have the decision-making power to make those decisions as long as you've kind of just followed this process of asking input from others. Because another thing that happens in many organizations is that after some point you kind of don't feel good about making any big changes because it's kind of outside of your role and your responsibility. So you kind of just give up on these bigger improvements. And a critical feature of a great software organization at scale is the ability to make these kind of bigger improvements all the time. So that's a pretty critical process to introduce. And even as a small team, we've already done a few of these kind of documents just internally to kind of explain our direction with certain architectural patterns that we are choosing.
Yeah. And you would even challenge the non-technical team members, like maybe product management or even business side, to maybe do this, like initiate this kind of ideas.
Yeah, I mean, definitely, I think it can work for any type of kind of improvements in the organization. And indeed, one of the ways to run a better remotely organized team is that you write a lot more and you write these documents and have a conversation in the context a little bit more asynchronously instead of scheduling a bunch of meetings, because people kind of have the assumption that work happens in meetings, while that's not really true. Meetings are great for thinking about things, but and having conversations and exploring ideas and so on, but it's not really the time to kind of drive these projects and figure out a lot of details. So you have to have someone who owns any of these projects, who will make sure that we're going to follow some kind of a structure to get through this decision, and gathers all the questions and doubts about it and all the risks. And then whatever risk we want to analyze, we're going to pull in the experts from the different parts of the organization to talk about it, so that we have it all covered.
Got it. Cool. I think we've covered a lot of interesting aspects. Maybe one thing that I would love to know about from you is about the kind of a software and the product industry. What do you think about the kind of challenges software or product development right now has? Like, what you see are the kind of challenges that you have to, let's say, as a founder, as a CEO, as a, have to think probably a lot of things. What are the main things that are on your mind to solve?
Well, companies at different stages have very different problems, and unfortunately, they also require a pretty different approach to solving them. So when you're thinking about the early product market fit, you just want to ignore a bunch of the wisdom about scaling organizations and really just try to make sure that you are building something very close to the customers and doing things that don't necessarily scale, but that still produce the right kind of a result. And then on the scaling part, it's fundamentally difficult. Like what we talked about, the learning being kind of the bottleneck in scaling software, that's never going to go away. Like, you're going to be hiring more people, your software systems are going to be more complex, the domain is going to get more complex as you kind of expand and have different teams working on it. And there's just no way to make it really smooth, because almost anything can be like a complex subset of problems. And I think that's maybe the one thing that people need to understand, that you need to be proactively fixing stuff as it comes up and as you're scaling, because otherwise it's really difficult or you'll find yourself in a place where stuff that used to take a few minutes now takes days, because it takes so long to get approvals from somewhere, or you have to do a bunch of manual tests and you cannot deploy to production today, and so on. So, but if you're able to address those bottlenecks as they emerge, then you'll likely do quite well. It's possible to scale it pretty much linearly as you grow, but it requires a constant effort of just trying to get better.
What's your dream? Like, if somebody wants to join Swarmia, what kind of dream are they kind of joining in? What kind of mission they are joining in?
Yeah, well, I think we're living an interesting time for software development, because there's a lot of knowledge about what the world looks like in an optimal situation. But at the same time, we realize that so many companies are not there. And it usually takes tens of years to adopt some best practices, like continuous integration, automated testing, and like continuous deployment, and like all kinds of things. Like, for some reason, it takes a really long time. And I think part of the problem is that this improvement has been treated as a big bang transformation project where you bring in external consultants. They don't really have the time to figure out what each team is doing and how they are doing it. So you're kind of just trying to get them all to do some kind of a transformation to agile or whatever, DevOps, whatever the buzzword is this month. And the end result is never going to be very good, just because there's always going to be problems when you change anything. So if you change things in a big bang, all the problems are going to be attributed to that transformation, and people are going to feel negative about that experience, and all the good stuff that was brought with it is not going to fly, because you're going to get kind of change resistance to it. So I think with Swarmia and with this incremental approach to continuous improvement, we can kind of help organizations get to modern best practices, and which is essentially just good for everyone's kind of well-being and work satisfaction when you're able to own decisions about your own work and so on. So with that, I think we can kind of renew the practices in the industry quite a bit by just helping every team get there one step at a time.
Thanks, Otto. All the best for Swarmia.
Thank you, Tep. Have a good day.
Cool. Thanks.